Doug, thank you so much for being part of our Speaking Truth to Youth project. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say and the answers and discussions with our questions. So the first one is, what in your younger years, I'll put it that way, caused you to become an activist?
First of all, I was raised in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York. My father was an executive at Eastman Kodak. We lived a typical privileged white suburban life. And I went to this very heavily segregated high school and went off to college and, did my kind of thing and focusing more on myself than anything else, quite frankly. Ironically, it wasn't until I got drafted and sent into the army and then sent to war that I really I woke up and realized what was going on in the world, and then thought to myself, what can I possibly do to make this world a better place? So a couple of things. One is that, again, the irony of being drafted, this is 1968. Back then, the war was just, the American war in Vietnam was just, ravishing everybody. And they were grabbing anything that could move. And so I literally was drafted out of graduate school and went from 8 weeks of basic training to 8 or 9 weeks in what they call advanced individual training in Oklahoma, and then given a few weeks leave and then sent to Vietnam by myself. I didn't go over with a unit or anything. So when I got off that plane with these guys screaming at me, I didn't know anybody. As I was there for 13 months, so in the Central Highlands, so I got to know guys, of course. But the other thing I like to point out is that, again, another irony. My first time of realizing what it's like to be a minority was when I was in basic training in Fort Dix, New Jersey. I looked around and there were all these black guys from Newark, and literally, I think I was the only white person with a college degree in that barracks, and felt totally isolated. And then it came on to me, this is what it's like to be a minority. So that started my journey. And then when I was in Vietnam, I was in the Central Highlands with the artillery unit, and we were close to this village. Over the months, I got to know a little bit about the village and the people in it and stuff like that. And I realized that this war was just total disaster, totally immoral, but not only politically, but obviously morally. And so I got increasingly angry and angry and angrier. I disobeyed orders when I was in Vietnam. I got, what they call an Article 13, which was a reduction in pay and threat to be thrown into jail. They did that to me because I broke this order. This major showed up and told us that we couldn't talk to the villagers anymore. And I've been there about 8 or 9 months, and this guy was brand new in country. And I just looked at him and said, screw you. Of course, they dragged me away and slapped me this Article 13. But he didn't realize who he was dealing with because I was I knew something about writing and thinking and whatnot. So I put together my defense and then got into a chopper and flew down to this Air Force base and went into their adjutant general's office, which is like the lawyers. And I presented my case. And these guys were stunned. They looked at me, and I'd been there in the country for quite a while. And they said, "Did you write this?" I said, "Yeah." And my argument was, you gave us this card that said, our job is to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. And how can we possibly do that if we're not allowed to talk to them? The guy looked at me and he said, "You're right. Article 13 rescinded." Of course, so then I go back to this little firebase that I was on, and this guy's, this major runs the whole show. And he was just beyond livid. He gave me all kinds of assignments that were, more dangerous than normal and, and more ridiculous. I survived. I got back, contrary to what some people have been told, how we were spat upon and all that kind of stuff. But they treated me really, really, really well, right? I mean, they were sympathetic. They wanted to know what was going on. And so we moved to Boston eventually, and I just got a job in a hospital counting out pills. I have a degree in economics. I'm supposed to be going that route. And I'm in this Coast Guard hospital counting pills, mainly because the guy who was running the hospital, when I went in there to apply for the job, he looked at me too and he said, "I'm going to give you a job. All you got to do is go into the basement every day and sit there and sort out these pills and do that kind of stuff." And it was exactly what I needed to do. I thought about joining the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, but they were heavily into drugs. And I was okay with it. I was into drugs too, but I didn't want to do that. So I joined the Socialist Workers' Party. And they had a very strong ethos against war. But I became much more politicized, if you will. I'm really a strong believer in community. We brag a lot about being strong individuals, but what we really need are people who are somewhat like-minded or are willing to talk anyways and willing to work with you and willing to have your back. And these people did. So I felt good about that. And then I decided to become a high school English teacher. So I went out to Seattle for a year and took a whole year of literature courses. When I came back to Boston and got in the Boston College's Master of Arts in Teaching program. And so the first thing they did to us that summer was put us into a summer school. around Boston, and about a third of the people who were in the program got out because I can't do this kind of stuff. I was just totally fascinated by working with young people. We were doing this because we felt a need to go into the public school system and make it a better place. My first full-time job was teaching for a year in a girls all Catholic, a Catholic all girls high school in Roslindale, Massachusetts, right next to Roxbury. The students were just really terrific, almost all working class Irish. They were hardworking, they were smart, they were engaging, and we literally could do stuff like I would say, okay, so what book do you guys want to read next? We decided my wife and I were going to have a family, and we decided we were going to move out of Boston, and so we came to Maine. And then moving into the Farmington area, to an old farmhouse in the Farmington area. But it was still a strong community, and people we took care of each other. Even though we had these different backgrounds and different political beliefs and stuff like that, and that sort of made me think this is what I want to do. I don't want to be one of these people, this activists out there self-righteously pointing at people and accusing them of doing horrible things, and they've got to change their lives to be like me, that kind of stuff. I wanted to talk to people honestly. I'm living in Farmington and joined this group called Western Mountain Peace Action Workshop, which was interesting. Peace activists from around the country. And one time we invited this couple to come speak to us about their experience in Nicaragua. Jerry and Judy Genesio went down to Nicaragua for this thing called Witness for Peace. And this was at the time the United States was waging this war in Central America. So they came and they spoke to us about that. And at the end of it, Jerry just said at the end of his talk, he said, I'm looking for some veterans who might want to join a peace group. And we formed this group called Veterans for Peace in 1985. And there were 5 of us. We formed our statement of purpose. We wanted to abolish war. We made a commitment to nonviolence, but we really wanted to join the peace movement and bring the veterans' voice into the peace movement. It didn't take very long for us to become a national and an international organization with 5,000 or 6,000 members, 130 chapters, 6 international chapters, NGO status, the United Nations. All of this would start with 5 people in Maine, rural Maine. There was this belief, again, this community thing. You're joining an organization that has some specific items in its agenda, and you've got your own personal agenda. So your job is to figure out how you can work your personal agenda into the organization's agenda. We moved along, and we still exist. Veterans for Peace is still around. Our current president is Susan Schnall, who was a nurse during the war in Vietnam. But she was court-martialed because she was demonstrating against the war, wearing her uniform, right? And then people said, you can't do that. And her argument was, well, William Westmoreland, the general who was running the war, can speak for the war wearing his uniform. I have a right to speak against the war wearing my uniform. She was dedicated to this notion that she owed something to the Vietnamese people in particular, and then to the world in general, because of all the damage that was done by an organization that she belonged to, which was the United States Navy. I also like to point out, if you're joining a group, it's oftentimes it's not just political, but it's therapeutic. You're with a bunch of people, you can really express your point of view, but it provides a forum where you can actually be vulnerable. Our society sort of dictates against that. It's supposed to be closed in on ourselves and not talk about our experiences. And, we look at it honestly and say, we've been through stuff that we'll never forget. So what do I do with it? Do I just bury it, or do I bring it up on occasion and use it for a positive mean? I'll segue into 3 years I spent up at the VA hospital in Togus, leading discussions up in the psychiatric ward. And what I did was I led discussions, weekly discussions, using poetry. And so I brought in poetry written from the Civil War, Walt Whitman, all the way through Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, of course, written by veterans. These people had never been exposed to that kind of stuff. So what? And we would read some of those, and then I would encourage them to write their poetry, their own poetry. And I said, what I like about poetry is that most war experiences are surrealistic, to say the least. I think a lot of it can be captured in a poem, which doesn't require a beginning, middle, or an end. You can just plunk yourself into, okay, you're under a mortar attack right now. Whoa, what's going on? And then we would, literally have these poems on a table in front of us. And I'd say, see, now we're talking about this artifact called a poem. We're not talking about you. We're not talking about your therapy. We're talking about this thing, this poem. Who's your audience? And that conversation continued. The nurses said it really helped a lot of these guys sleep, actually, because they were working on their poems. And I remember one young man who was a Afghan war veteran sitting there hunkered down, and we're talking about nightmares. And all of a sudden, this guy he rises up from his chair and he says, man, I don't have nightmares, I have daymares. I'm here because my wife found me standing out on our lawn buck naked, screaming at the traffic going by. We're very sympathetic to him. We're listening to him. He started coming to our meetings and he came out of himself. If people talk about activism, they oftentimes think in terms of political goals. We want to abolish war. Have you abolished war? No. But we have done these things. We've set up goals for ourselves. My goals are to work towards that aspiration somehow. What can we possibly do? And by the way, we're very proud of the fact that when we formed Veterans for Peace, we did not segregate women into auxiliary status like all other veterans groups did.
Has given the situation in the world right now, what continues to give you hope or courage or what guides you?
What bothers me, I think, and since I'm an old duffer and I'm a writing guy as opposed to social media and AI and all of this stuff, I'm just appalled and mystified and maybe scared to some extent by the level of frequency of these messages and how quickly things get out there without any kind of careful, editing, if you will, or discussion or whatnot. Somebody has an idea and they post it to one of these things and all of a sudden it's out there and everybody's jumping all over it and talking about this, about and everything like that, without giving it the appropriate time to think things through. I'm a huge fan of Buffy Sainte-Marie, who is a folk singer, anti-war, and she wrote this wonderful song called "The Universal Soldier." And so I'm teaching this peace studies course, and when we get to the Vietnam War, I say, "Well, here, listen to this." I showed a video clip of her standing alone on a stage with an acoustic guitar, singing this amazing song. So I would look at the students with a stern look of this old guy and say, "There's no way anybody in your generation can come up with anything like this." The rest of the semester, every class we would begin with somebody bringing in a video clip of somebody from their generation singing, something a politically charged, well, not necessarily anti-war, but politically charged song. And then we would discuss, and that gave me great hope. My students cared a lot. And one of my favorite examples was this. We studied the suffragette movement, and this was fighting for women's rights at the turn of the 20th century. And then they talked about the incredible courage it took for these women to fight against this kind of crap. And I was just so impressed by that. That's one example of, I have hope from my experience as an educator that things are moving along.
What advice do you have for young people, speaking of being a lifelong educator and seeing hope in people?
Be careful. Somebody could come along and get you heavily involved in something, and all of a sudden you're looking at a line of police, and you're going to get arrested, and then maybe get kicked out of the school that you're in. So you have to be really, really careful. There's a thing that I used to use in my teaching called the tactic star. It's like 12 steps to think about if you're going to be involved in any kind of action at all. Think about these things. Where is it going to take place? Who's your audience? When is it going to take place? What's your support? Who's with you? And you meet with these affinity groups first. You don't go out there by yourself. You can meet with a bunch of people who are, and you talk things through and you figure out, do you have each other's back or not? If in fact the police show up and say, you have to leave, what are we going to do? Form affinity groups and figure out what you're going to do. I think empathy is part of who we are as human beings. We want to help other people. So be careful.
Thank you so much for all this conversation and for all you've done in your life and continue to do. Thanks.